What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Bush coming at you solo today to talk about some sell high running backs. And specifically in this video, this is going to be a fun one. This is one of the biggest edges that is still available in Dynasty. It's selling high on aging running backs before they plateau and they tank and all that kind of stuff. I'm basically going to go through this video, talk about kind of like an investing concept that this relates to. Then I'm going to get into why we want to sell these running backs, the history, the medical, pieces behind it, and then talk about which running backs that we're actually talking about from a micro level. That was all the macro stuff. We'll talk about micro level, which running back should you be looking to sell, and I'm sure you'll see them on the thumbnail of this video. You guys have kind of heard us talk about this before, but this is the official, one-stop shop for everything you need to know about how to handle aging running backs in Dynasty Fantasy Football. So if you're new, hit the like button, comment any of your thoughts down below, subscribe to the channel if you are new. We're going to hit the intro, and then we're going to get right into this. Okay, so quick note before we get into the video, go check out the Patreon right now. If you guys haven't already signed up for the Patreon, we have our updated Dynasty rankings coming in the next couple of days. We're adding our top 36 overall rookies for one quarterback for Superflex, and then we're also adding our rookie rankings to the veterans, right, within the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end rankings, and then also within the bucketed rankings by age bracket. And I'll show, some pictures on the screen so you guys know what I'm talking about. But that's basically what we're up to on the Patreon right now. We also have our draft class databases with fully updated athletic testing as well. So if you guys are interested, how did this guy do at the combine? You don't want to, go through every single player individually. We have a spreadsheet for each of the databases to show you everything that you need to know. So that's available on the Patreon. But without further ado, let's get right into this. My intro was kind of confusing. I apologize. I don't really know how to explain this topic, but this whole video is centered around this investing concept. And, you guys know that we're the Fantasy Stock Exchange. So we got to bring some investing stuff into the fold. But what's called a stop loss order in investing is basically what we're doing in fantasy football. So a stop loss order basically is, let's say I own some stock in Coca-Cola and I want my stock to reach 20, 30% rate of return, but I don't want it to dip below 10%. So I'll tell my stockbroker, whoever's handling my finances, that if my stock dips below 10%, I want you to sell because I don't want to lose a whole lot of value. I just want to let it keep growing, keep growing, keep growing. If it goes to, below 5%, 6%, that's fine because it'll probably go back up. But once it dips below a certain percentage, then I want you to sell it. And I'm basically coining this now, but selling aging running backs in fantasy is the fantasy football version of a stop loss order. And you haven't lost the value yet necessarily, but you're losing some with each day, each month that passes. And you want to sell before it goes below a certain point, because if that asset tanks, then you're going to be stuck holding the bag. Nobody wants that to happen. You don't want to be stuck holding the bag on some junk bonds or whatever. So from a fantasy football perspective, what am I talking about? And basically what I'm going to start with is why running back touches and running back age matters. And then I'm going to talk about the actual players that we're discussing in this video. So here's a medical study conducted in 2012 explaining the concept that I'm talking about. So I have real medical research behind this. I'm not just making this up. So as you guys can see on the screen, I think it's probably common knowledge that younger running backs tend to be more effective than older running backs. It's the reason that teams are hesitant in the actual NFL of paying second contracts to running backs. It's the reason that people don't like taking running backs in the first round of the NFL draft because they don't have a long shelf life. Age 23, age 24, age 25, 26 is typically the prime of a running back. And when we get running backs like Javonte Williams, Cam Akers that are in the NFL by age 21, 20 and a half years old, that's what we want because we want them to be productive for fantasy as long as possible. But the problem is many people who are contending or in win now situations in Dynasty, they'll favor the devil that they know, right? They'll go out and acquire Dalvin Cook and Nick Chubb and Joe Mixon, guys that have produced before. When it comes to the production for their fantasy team, they want the safety. They want the guaranteed production when in fact that's hurting their Dynasty roster in the long term. So they'd rather have that surefire running back one type production than bet on a young piece to take that step to that running back one production. But the whole point of this video is to get out before you're left holding the bag. And as you guys can see on the screen, typically the age apex for the running back position is below the age of 27. You guys can see at age 27 to 28, they start to lose about just over a half a fantasy point per game. Then by age 28 to 29, they're losing over a point per game. And you can see the total yardage dipping as well, because running back production takes a steady decline once you reach age 27, age 28, age 29. And the easiest way to visualize this and exemplify this based on previous running backs that we've seen in the last couple of years is by looking at previous year's ADP. This is ADP per DLF from 2018. Now, I want you to look at who is at the top of this list, right? Todd Gurley, we all know, had a number of injuries and is basically out of the league now. He's not even on an NFL roster. And dynasty players that were taking Todd Gurley as the 101 in most dynasty leagues, or at least the first running back off the board, at the time, you were probably assuming, hey, I'm going to get 3-4 years of elite fantasy running back one production, top 5 fantasy running back production out of Todd Gurley. I'm going to get that out of David Johnson and out of Le'Veon Bell. I'm going to get solid RB1 production from Devontae Freeman and Mark Ingram and Jay Ajayi and all these guys. But the harsh truth, the harsh reality is that running backs are going to fall off sooner than you think. And it's probably going to happen a year or two sooner than you think. So if you draft a running back in a startup this year and say, hey, I'm going to get this guy for the next 5, 6, 7 years, he's going to be a stud for my roster. The reality is that's probably not going to happen. If it does happen, that running back will probably be on the fast track to the Hall of Fame, because that typically doesn't happen in today's NFL. Other than age, there has been a more effective way of predicting this. And that's kind of the whole point of this video. Running back touch counts is what we want to use rather than age, because if you've been following this channel for a while, I'm sure you've seen this chart before. The point of it is that if you're new, the biggest declines come from 1,250 to 2,000 career touches. That's typically when running backs start to decline. Usually that'll come if you're a workhorse running back from day one of your rookie contract. That'll typically come by the end of your rookie contract, year 4, year 5, year 6 of your NFL career. And that's precisely the zone that we're talking about. So like I said, 1,250 to 2,000 career touches is the zone that we're talking about. There's a lot of running backs that are currently very, very valuable in dynasty and in fantasy in general that are going in this range in terms of career touches. So this study concluded overall that running back production does in fact get affected by wear and tear. It's not just age. It's also how many touches that they're getting. So for example, a 29-year-old running back could still be productive in his NFL career, like Raheem Mostert's 29, for example, versus a guy that's 29 who also has 2,000 career touches under his belt, right? Common sense, but it's not usually common practice for most people. So we should be wary of this range, because history suggests that these guys are going to lose productivity and loss of dynasty value as a result. So that's kind of, again, I hope that made sense to everybody. That was kind of like a lot of mumbo jumbo, but PFF also basically did a similar study, but they, instead of measuring pure fantasy production and yardage production, they decided to look at efficiency numbers. And I think this is also important, like equally important, because we obviously want our fantasy running backs to be efficient with their touches. Typically, running backs are going to get a lot of touches when they're good. And, if you're not good, you're not going to get a lot of touches. So the two are usually directly correlated. And in that study, raw fantasy output was affected by efficiency. As you guys can see on the screen, along the bottom axis there, you can see years in the NFL was correlated with their rushing yards over expectation. So you can see at the beginning of their NFL career, they were their average rushing yards over expectation was above 0, right? And that's what you want out of your fantasy running back. You want them to be better than the average running back running the ball. And as you can see, once they got to year 5, year 6, year 7 of their NFL career, that average started to dip below. Now, obviously, this is based on all running backs, not just the really, really good fantasy running backs. So it's a little bit, biased to some degree, but it holds true. When you think of when running backs are falling off in recent years, it's usually year 5, year 6, year 7 of their NFL career. The other interesting thing that I found really, really fascinating was that they also tested conventional wisdom in the fact that many people, I'm sure this will come up for a couple running backs this year, running backs with a big workload the year before, there was no correlation to their effectiveness the following season. And I'm sure a lot of people will, be wary of certain running backs because they had a big workload the year before. But the key is career touches. The reason it correlates is because if you have a big workload the year before and you're in your 6th NFL season, then you should be wary of it. But when you're Jonathan Taylor, who just came off your 2nd NFL season with a big workload, then it's not a concern. That is the key to this discussion. It is career touches. And what they concluded was a similar thing to the other study that we talked about, is that after about 1,500 rushes, running backs are declining at a very, very rapid pace. And is this just a recent thing? Is this just something that's recently happening? Or is this something historical? And the findings of another study, fantasy running backs are declining at a more rapid pace now than they were in the 1980s and the 1990s. And to me, this is probably because running backs are smaller and they're taking a bit more of a beating now than they were back in the day, because running backs were typically like 230, 240 at minimum back in the day. Now that they're more like 205, 210 pounds, it's easier for them to wear down. And as you guys can see, I have them circled right here. The blue line is the 2000. So this is actually, 10 years old, this study. I would imagine that it's probably even more so a steeper decline nowadays. So like I mentioned earlier, we can think of recent examples of dynasty managers that wish they could have gotten out of these running backs a year earlier. Zeke, Todd Gurley, Le'Veon Bell, David Johnson, DeMarco Murray, guys that were very, very productive fantasy running backs at one point in their career, but their fantasy managers, their dynasty managers were left holding the bag because they didn't sell them at that peak value. So who am I talking about? Who are we actually getting into? That was all the macro stuff. Let's get into micro player analysis, guys that we're actually talking about right now that you can take action on. These are the current leaders in touches that are fantasy relevant. Now, for guys like Zeke, for Derrick Henry, for Melvin Gordon, many will believe, the market will probably believe that a decline is already imminent because they've already seen it. With Ezekiel Elliott, I'm pretty sure most people believe that he is a declining player. With Derrick Henry, most people just expect it to happen. Not necessarily they haven't seen it yet, but they saw the injury last year, and that'll lead them to believe that career touches matter for a guy like him. And Melvin Gordon obviously has been, not an RB1 type for the last couple of years, but he was fantasy relevant last year. So I decided to include him here. The entire purpose of this video, like I said, is to get out before it happens to the next group of running back, right? Last year, I was talking about this with Ezekiel Elliott. It was the reason I wasn't drafting him in redraft leagues. It was the reason I wasn't drafting him in dynasty leagues, is because I was a year early on Ezekiel Elliott. And I would always rather be a year early on these running backs than a year too late. Put a fantasy football stop loss order on these next few running backs: Alvin Kamara, Joe Mixon, Dalvin Cook, Leonard Fournette, Christian McCaffrey, Aaron Jones, Nick Chubb. All of these guys are either approaching the age of 27, and you can include Austin Eckler in this as well, or they're already there. And many of them have a lot of mileage on their tires, right? They're the guys with a lot of carries, like Joe Mixon, like Dalvin Cook, Nick Chubb, Leonard Fournette, are guys who I'm specifically trying to sell right now, because this all stems from the principles that I've talked about in this video so far. Number one, we know that these guys are expected to lose fantasy potency as their career goes along. Number two, it usually happens a year or two earlier than we expect it to happen. And number three, it's better to be earlier than late. You want to be a year too early on these guys, not a year too late. Similar to what we say with young running backs, you want to be a year early on the breakout than you do a year late on the breakout, versus the same thing for the aging running backs. You want to be a year early on the decline versus a year late on the decline. Now, the reason and the most recent example of this is Ezekiel Elliott, because I am certain that there are, players like you guys, maybe you did this, and leave a comment down below if you did. You had a contending dynasty roster last year, and you went out and traded for Ezekiel Elliott, thinking that you were getting an RB1 for the next 2, maybe 3 years if he's lucky, and then he would decline. But not half a season. He declined in half a year after you made that trade versus the 2 to 3 years that you were probably expecting. And people are saying the same things right now about guys like Dalvin Cook and Joe Mixon, and guys that they think they're getting 2 to 3 more really, really productive years out of those guys, but that's not necessarily a guarantee. Now, I'm not saying that all of these guys will stink next year and they'll be terrible and they'll be no longer fantasy relevant, or even the year after. They could have another year, 2 years of relevant fantasy production. I'm saying that the downside risk that they get injured or that they lose their, fantasy productivity outweighs that extra point or two that you might be getting over a young running back. So say, you think Dalvin Cook is going to outscore Antonio Gibson by 3 points next year. The downside risk of having Dalvin Cook over Antonio Gibson is much larger, because Antonio Gibson is 23 years old and Dalvin Cook is 26 years old and has all these career touches under his belt. So the advice in this video is to turn over your running back core, even if you have a contending roster. And I'll show you in a second what I did, because I had a contending roster where I turned over my running back core using some of these guys, and try and flip them for younger backs or for draft picks, especially if you play in a more casual league where players might overvalue immediate production, similar to the way they would in a redraft league. So if, Nick Chubb and Dalvin Cook, these guys are viewed as top end dynasty running backs in the eyes of your league mates because they've been very, very productive in the past. They're going to continue to be very, very productive in the eyes of your league mates. Antonio Gibson, J.K. Dobbins, Travis Etienne, Breece Hall, Kenneth Walker, Isaiah Spiller, aka draft picks in this year, 2023's class, Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, etc. That is how you should be looking to replenish your running back core going forward. You should not be waiting until you're holding the bag. And like I said, what kind of analyst would I be if I didn't practice what I preached? I sold Dalvin Cook in a league where I had a competitive team. I was third in my league last year. I got ousted in the first round of the fantasy playoffs in the fantasy championship. I did it because I wanted to increase my longevity. So I traded Dalvin Cook away for Deshaun Watson. And it was Dalvin Cook in the 206 for Deshaun Watson. And the reason I invested in Deshaun Watson is, number one, I think he's a prime buy low candidate right now because his legal situation is starting to clear up a little bit. We're hearing a lot of rumblings. The Panthers and the Seahawks and all these teams are really, really in on Deshaun Watson. So I decided to sell Dalvin Cook so I'm not left holding the bag. Could Dalvin Cook have another very, very productive season this year? Sure. But I think the downside risk is that Dalvin Cook deals with a bunch of injuries, or maybe he's just not as effective as he was earlier in his career. And then that person who I traded Dalvin Cook to is left holding the bag, not me. And I did this because I wanted to increase my longevity. I don't want to be forced to sell Justin Herbert. You guys can see what my team looks like on the screen. Just imagine that Dalvin Cook was in my RB1 slot. I don't want to be forced to sell Justin Herbert. I don't want to be forced to sell Justin Jefferson next year because both of my running backs declined and they both got injured and they're no longer valuable in Dynasty. And then I have to rebuild this team and overhaul it completely. I would rather be a year too early to sell Dalvin Cook and miss out on competing again next year, because I know I have to take a good, long, hard look in the mirror and say that if I suffer one injury, my team is going down to shit. So I need to make that transition now before Alvin Kamara and Dalvin Cook have no value. And that's basically the decision you want to be making if you're in the predicament that I was in. Now, if you have a win now roster stocked with, 3 or 4 of these guys and 3 or 4 elite wide receivers and 2 elite quarterbacks with another good quarterback and an elite tight end, by all means, go try and win your championship. But if you can, try and increase your longevity, try and increase your flexibility, pick up a more value insulated asset like a young quarterback or like a talented young wide receiver, or using these peak running backs, go out and get a younger running back who hasn't proven it yet, like Travis Etienne, like J.K. Dobbins, like Antonio Gibson, like Cam Akers, even coming off of his Achilles injury. Their value can only go down from here. Dalvin Cook, Joe Mixon, Alvin Kamara. Those are the 3 guys specifically that I'm looking to shop, and also Nick Chubb, and other guys like that. Banged up next year, their value goes into the toilet. If they miss 6-7 games next year, their value will be in the toilet like Ezekiel Elliott's is right now, like Todd Gurley's was a couple of years ago, like Le'Veon Bell's was a couple of years ago. If that happens to a young running back, and we already saw this happen, J.K. Dobbins tore his ACL before the season. Travis Etienne had a Liz Frank foot injury. They're still top 15, top 20 dynasty running backs right now because they're 22 years old. That is how, value insulation works when it comes to age. I wish it didn't work like that. And I wish running backs had, 10-year productive NFL careers, but that's just the reality of the situation that we're looking for. And even less so for quarterbacks and wide receivers do you have to worry about injuries, because they're just a much more value insulated position than running backs. So quick, before I wrap this video up, I just want to show you some of the pieces that you can get for a guy like Dalvin Cook and Joe Mixon and Alvin Kamara and these guys. So you guys can see a couple trades per DLF's trade finder on the screen right now. Dalvin Cook and Alexander Mattison. So the Vikings backfield was sold for a first rounder in 2022 and a second rounder in 2022 as well. I think that's a good package to move off of that backfield. Dalvin Cook was sold with a second round pick in exchange for Cam Akers and a first round pick. Again, that's probably more of a redraft thinking type of league, and you can get away with stuff like that. Dalvin Cook and 2 picks were sold for Terry McLaurin and Antonio Gibson. Great move right there. Saquon Barkley in exchange for Dalvin Cook and Alexander Mattison with Michael Gallup attached. Another good move there. Joe Mixon, same thing. You can sell Joe Mixon in the 111 for Elijah Moore in the 107. Great move there to try and increase your longevity. Now, obviously, you want to get a running back in return if you're still trying to compete, but you can use that 107 on a running back. You should be able to get an Isaiah Spiller type with that pick. And then Joe Mixon was sold in a package with Cooper Kupp and Dalton Schultz, some other win now pieces, and they got 2 first-round picks, De'Ami Brown, and a 2023 first and second. Like, these are the types of trades that you can make using these running backs because they still have a lot of value. You can go out and buy low on a guy like DK Metcalf. You can go out using Alvin Kamara, buy low on a guy like Saquon Barkley, who's a year and a half younger with a lot less career touches under his belt. Yes, he's been injured in the past couple of years, but I have a lot more faith in Saquon Barkley going forward than I do Alvin Kamara to not fall victim to that running back touch threshold. Alvin Kamara sold for Robert Woods in a first round pick. Alvin Kamara sold for Christian McCaffrey in a third. Alvin Kamara for Christian McCaffrey straight up. Alvin Kamara for De'Ami Brown, a first and a second. Again, some of these trades just make a lot of sense to me. I think a lot of people should be shopping these running backs and seeing what they can get in return. Ideally, in an ideal situation, you take your Dalvin Cook and you flip him for Antonio Gibson. So that way you still have a young running back that'll help you win right now, but you also increase your longevity and your flexibility. And that person who bought that player might just be thinking, Dalvin Cook's going to be better for the next 2 years, and I don't have to worry about it after that and beyond that point. So that's basically what we're talking about here. Christian McCaffrey and Derrick Henry are tough because their values are both down due to recent injuries. So I'm not necessarily talking about these 2 guys right now. And the other thing with those 2 guys is that both of those guys are having Hall of Fame caliber careers, in my opinion. At least when they've been on the field, they've been Hall of Fame caliber running backs. So I believe that those 2, by the time that their career's done, could be Hall of Famers. So I'm more inclined to keep guys like that rather than guys like, Dalvin Cook, Nick Chubb, Joe Mixon, Alvin Kamara, who are obviously really good players. They've made Pro Bowls and all pro teams and stuff. but they're not going to be in the Hall of Fame someday. I don't think they're going to be outliers relative to what Christian McCaffrey and Derrick Henry have done thus far in their careers. Christian McCaffrey had an 1,000 season. Derrick Henry had a 2,000-yard rushing season. They're much more closer to Hall of Fame outliers like Adrian Peterson and Frank Gore types who have played later in their careers, rather than a guy like Alvin Kamara, who's a lot more similar to like a Jamal Charles, who was a very good running back in his prime, but fell off just like most running backs do. So again, that was a lot of information. If you guys followed that, let me know in the comments. If you wanted me to explain anything further, I'd be happy to engage with you down there. Check out our other videos that we've dropped the past couple of days. We dropped a Superflex rookie mock draft on Monday. We talked about all the recent news the same day on a live stream, if you want to check that out. If you guys want to support us in any way, check out the Patreon. Like I said, Dynasty Rankings Manifesto, big update coming this week, adding in the rookies to our overall rankings, to our, adding in our rookie rankings in general. All that stuff will be available probably Friday or Saturday. So if you want to check out the Patreon, link is in the description for that. We also have, sponsors that you can check out the links for in the description as well. Promo code FSE at underdogfantasy.com, promo code Bush for manscaped.com. Peace out. We'll talk to you soon.